Hello, church. I want to say, doesn't Jesus just get more beautiful and more beautiful the more you get to know him and the closer you walk with him? And even as you discover more and more scripture that talks about him, at some point, isn't it just wonderful to celebrate the fact that as you park there in scripture, if you struggle today with reading the Bible and not getting it to connect with Jesus, I would encourage you, park there longer and ask the Holy Spirit to reveal something to you, and don't leave until that's happened. There's so many good things in there. In chapter 20, we could talk about a number of things, but recognize this: when they are going to war, who is it that makes a statement, a speech to the army before they go into a human battle? It's the priest. It says that in verse 2 out of chapter 20. And the priest makes a statement to them, telling them it's actually the Lord's battle that you're going to go fight. This human battle, this physical battle, is completely connected to the spiritual battle that we are in. This is what Ephesians chapter 6 talks about in the New Testament. We are in a spiritual battle, yet we're in a physical world. That's all one and the same. You cannot disconnect them. And you see that right here in the Old Testament. It's awesome. And you just think about, how am I engaging in the spiritual battle today? And am I doing that intentionally? Oh, already so rich. And then listen to this. They're going into that battle and they are assured of victory because God is going with them. They cannot lose. They're not going to lose. God has never lost a battle and never will. And yet, if you look at verse 7 of that same chapter, it actually points out that some people are going to die in the battle. There is actually a cost in the battle. We are guaranteed, this is, in Christianity, we are guaranteed victory. In fact, we already have it. In Colossians 3, it says, since you have been raised with Christ. In other words, it's past tense. We already have been raised with Christ. We are victorious. We come from a place of victory and we will be victorious. We've already won. But Luke 14, Jesus says, count the cost. And he uses exactly the same analogy here in verse 1 of this chapter. It talks about going against an army that's way bigger than yours. And it's the same thing. Jesus used that same analogy in Luke 14. Count the cost, because if you're going against a bigger army, there's going to be a cost to that battle. You could even ask this question. Jesus, I recognize that there's going to be I'm involved in a spiritual battle. It's going to come at a cost. Jesus, am I willing to pay the cost to be involved in the spiritual battle, which I know I will win with you as my commander and my priest and my king? Oh, church, come on. Doesn't that just make you want to go out and run into the world and say, Jesus, let's go talk about people. Let's go bring some more souls to you. Let's get involved in the harvest. Who's our king? Who's our priest? Oh, church is so good. Then we get into Deuteronomy chapter 21. It's a whole chapter about Jesus. Whether it's talking about this unintentional sin in the beginning of the chapter in which atonement has to get made, that we need the same with Jesus' blood. Whether it's talking about how to treat women, 1 Peter 3 talks about that in the New Testament. And it's a beautiful thing that leads us to God's perspective and value of people and value of women and so on. We talk about the firstborn, again, leads us to Jesus. I want to park here a little bit when it comes to this rebellious children. In verse 18 to 21. There's a couple of things we can note here. First of all, we could probably spend some time praising the Lord that the civic law of verse 18 to 21 no longer applies. Amen? Because just if you're not sure what I mean, just read it. Anyway, but the moral laws obviously come out are pretty simple. God expects parents to discipline their children, and God expects children to heed the discipline and advice of their parents. You could even spend time with Jesus and ask him a question in that regard. And even if the question isn't on the screen now, consider that and then talk to Jesus about that. And ask him if you're following along his moral will. And then you get into chapter 22, and there are some various laws. And again, there's a lot of civic and separation laws, some of which are very interesting and fascinating to think about what life must have been like for them back then. But as you're reading through that, don't wipe out the chapter, because there's a lot of moral laws that clearly connect into the New Testament, are actually all about Jesus, what he said, and how we ought to apply those to our lives today. For instance, you might notice that in chapter 22, verses 1 to 4, 3 times it says the words, do not ignore. And so, for instance, if you'd connect that to James 4:17, that says anyone who knows the good that they ought to do and doesn't do it, they actually sin. Same thing here. So we're not maybe tempted to ignore somebody's ox or donkey so much, but there's a lot of ways in which we treat other people that we might be tempted to ignore them, knowing we should actually do something about that, but be tempted to not do it. And that moral law aspect applies to us today. And then you'll even get into some marriage violations here in verse 13 and on. And I would just say this, within some civic laws and the ways that those things were carried out, there is a clear moral law aspect of who God is. And Hebrews chapter 13 and Matthew chapter 5 would call us today to practice sexual purity in a way that God's moral laws have always dictated for marriage, whether it's sex before marriage or sex outside of marriage, or sex just to be contained within one man and one woman for life. Anything outside of that goes against God's moral law. And then you could spend some time with Jesus today, and if that is something that is relevant in your life, you could ask Jesus, am I conforming cheerfully to your moral laws? And then part on one of those things today and celebrate Jesus.